Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by Open Dairy. I am Beth Holcomb. I'm Vice President of Membership and Communications for ADPI, and before we get started, I'd like to touch on a few tips for today's webinar. Questions can be submitted at any time during today's presentation using the Q&A icon. As a registered attendee, you will be receiving a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording following this live event. So at any time, if you need to leave or experience a connectivity issue, you will be receiving the presentation in its entirety within 48 hours after the webinar. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today, Dalen Dye, CEO of Breakout Strategic Coaching. Throughout his career, Dalen has held C-suite and board positions developing and leading teams to maximize their performance. Dalen's leadership experience includes 17 years as a CEO of an international marketing, trading, and manufacturing company that served the food manufacturing industries in over 50 countries. His coaching experience spans industries, including food and beverage, retail, insurance, manufacturing, private equity, energy, finance, advising, technical startups, and family-owned businesses. He enjoys giving back by leveraging his insights to help other business executives and teams develop their leadership and grow in their career. His company, Breakout Strategic Coaching, was created with this mission as its foundation. Welcome, Dalen. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for the reminder to unmute. I'm excited to be with you all here today hosting this topic, moderating this topic, especially having worked with so many different industries, as Beth just described, in my semi-retired years, now to be able to be working with you all in the dairy industry. And with that in mind, sometimes I think we have the impression that the dairy industry is a conservative industry and slow to change. And while there might be some truth to that, over the years, we've seen technology be applied in many different ways through dairy. Think about it, from milk cans to milking machines, and today robots that are milking our cows while sending real-time information to iPhones and computers. At the same time, scanners are collecting and tracking the data for each cow that is being milked. And in just a short 20 years, we've seen open outcry trading of dairy futures and cash markets at the CME move to on the screen and on our iPhones. Some, even maybe me, resisted that change and thought that this might be the death of those markets. Yet the opposite happened as these markets continue to grow and thrive today. People adapted and people leveraged technology. Of course, for all of us, when we buy milk or cheese or butter at the grocery store, often it's not long after that that we end up getting pop-up ads on our search engines. And just this past week, many of you saw an article in the Wall Street Journal that was entitled, "Next time you buy Parmesan, watch out for the microchip." European cheesemakers are using microtransponder chips in their packaging for traceability, standard of identity, and even consumer trend applications. And we've seen the evolution of technology through these market online auctions that are happening both abroad and in the US. The reality is that the global dairy landscape is changing rapidly, and we're experiencing that. Environmental and economic pressures is making it difficult to grow milk production in traditional dairy export regions in the world outside of the United States, especially Oceania and Europe. And at the same time, global dairy demand and for our products continues to grow. To put it in simple terms, global demand is growing faster than demand here in the US. Not really a new trend, but certainly we continue to see it today. And global dairy production seems to be not able to grow as fast as production here is in the US. This creates what appears to be an opportunity for US dairy to serve these clients. And in reality, we've seen that, haven't we? If we go back, I don't know the exact data, I didn't look it up, but you can probably go back 15, 20 years. we were only at a couple of percent of our milk that was going overseas serving clients. Today, it must be approaching 20%. But this also creates challenges for our industry and for your companies. How do we best access these clients, navigating the financial, logistical, geopolitical, counterparty, and even volatility, among other risks that are associated with serving clients overseas? One might think that we are only at the early stage of using technology in our industry, which is where the concept for Digitization 2.0 was born for this webinar. What does the future of technology have in store for us? We have a great panel of guests who will try to answer this question from a variety of perspectives. You have their bios, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I do want to make the formal introductions. We have Mike McCulley, founder of McCulley Consulting, known to many of you. And Mike will talk about the U.S. dairy market situation and what will be needed in the next years. We also have Sebastian Wooters, global head of e-commerce at Kuehne Nagel, and also an Amazon grad, if you will. And he'll talk about digitization and supply chains from a logistics and e-commerce perspective. And we have Martijn Gethart, co-founder and CEO of Open Dairy. We'll talk about challenges and opportunities of digitization and data in the dairy industry specifically. So gentlemen, welcome to the panel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to share his thoughts.
Hey, thank you, Dale, and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're at in the world, or good morning or good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and participate in today's discussion. And as Dalen mentioned there a minute ago, talking about where we're at and kind of going in the future, I think back a few years ago to a conference and had a speaker, kind of a futuristic speaker, talking about where we could be going and kind of describing the future. And my thought was, is the future the Jetsons or is it the Matrix? I'm not sure which it is. And one's a pretty scary one, and one's a much happier one. And kind of bring it back to dairy. I think we've seen a lot of changes, as Dalen mentioned. You go back, actually it was about 2006, 2007 when the U.S. entered the export market in a big way, and has continued to expand since then. Now there's always ups and downs with that, and we've seen in the last few years lots of disruption, not only in domestic demand but also global demand. And last year for the U.S. was a big year in exports. This year it's been more competitive in terms of pricing, but it's kind of interesting dynamics that we've seen here really over the last year or so. Let's say maybe the COVID hangover has really been more around demand, because if we look at milk supply in the main export regions defined as Europe, U.S., Oceania, as well as Argentina, milk production has been growth. It's been some growth, but pretty weak. I mean, it's less than 1%, or at best 1% in a few months here over the last year, and going back into last year negative. And typically we would see 1% growth in milk being enough to keep up with the growth in demand, and that really hasn't been the case so far this year, with some weak demand, particularly in some of the key import regions. So as we look out for the balance of the year, the rate of growth has been slowing in Europe. It's turned negative in the U.S. in the last 2 months, and I think if you look at where Oceania is at, Australia is probably going to continue to struggle, and with the milk price cuts in New Zealand, they're going to struggle as well. So I think the way my view is right now, the outlook is probably flat at best in the U.S., if not a bit lower as we go through the balance of the year. And when we get to Oceania and Europe, probably also a bit of a negative outlook there. As we look at where prices have been, it's a very different dynamic, and depending on what product you're really interested in. As I talk to clients, not only here in the U.S. but around the world, I have to think about, okay, what are they, a U.S. cheese or U.S. butter company, or they talking about, we need to talk about global milk powder, because it's very different discussions here in the last couple of months, where for those of you that are in the markets daily know that there's been a lot of excitement and huge changes in the cheese market here in the U.S. over the last several months. But if you look at that graph on the left on this page, European and New Zealand prices really haven't done all that much. So again, a lot of volatility here in the U.S. market. You flip over to the right side of the page, and the overall global dairy trade price index has continued to move lower. And with the last event, again, for those of you that follow this closely, know that it was a huge drop, probably more than expected, with it about 11% drop in whole milk powder. I had to extend the y-axis range lower to capture the last event's results. So, again, a lot of uncertainty here when we talk about not only the supply outlook, but demand, and more so than usual. If you follow the headlines, it's pretty much every day there's something generally negative about the Chinese economy, whether it's their overall health of the economy, the real estate market, youth unemployment, demand, factory output, things like that. So still a lot of challenges there. If you're glass half full, you're probably thinking that maybe we're getting to the low end on these prices and start seeing things move higher as we get into the balance this year out into 2024. But again, like just what's happened over the last few months or so coming out of Q2 is where the market outlook was pretty gloomy on milk powders. It hasn't gotten any better and probably gotten worse really as we got into Q3, at least on that side of the ledger. The really fascinating part to me when we look at what's going on globally is right here in the U.S. and just an amazing amount of investments in new plants. And for those of you that, again, that follow this pretty closely, have heard me talk about this, and I'll be talking about this a lot for the next year or more. There's actually closer to $6 billion, billion with a B, in new plant and dairy plant investments, as well as expansions around the country right now. And a lot of this is going to come online really over the next 2 years. We've seen a little coming online here in 23, and then we've got more coming online in 24. And particularly by the time we get out to the end of 24 and early 25, we've got several large new cheese plants coming online. And if you can see this map well enough, first of all, the colors of the states are where the milk production is either increasing or declining over the last decade. And the biggest growth states are in South Dakota and Texas and Kansas, and kind of in that middle part of the country. And I've circled, while we see overall state growth, I've circled the areas within the key regions here where we're seeing the most of the milk growth, and it's less than 10. And not coincidentally, that's where a lot of these plant investments are happening. A lot of them in cheese and whey, as well as extended shelf life beverages and aseptic fluid milk products. So you really don't see much on here with butter and milk powder. They've kind of went through that phase a while back, and right now there's just a large amount of growth in new processing capacity investments for cheese and whey powder. And again, for those of you that follow this closely, what I'll be talking about a lot here going forward is what are the impacts on the different markets, the cheese markets, the whey markets, the overall milk markets for this investment. So we haven't seen this level of investment probably in the U.S. in quite a few years. Europe went through a large amount of investment when the quotas came off back in 2015. New Zealand's had rounds of investment in the past as well. But as kind of back to where we started to talking about global growth in demand and where's the supply going to come from, Europe is largely probably has, if not hit their peak, if they're getting close to it, and maybe declining in the future given the sustainability and all the different regulations coming at them in different countries. Same thing's happening in New Zealand, where they've probably reached peak milk as well. So if we got growing global demand for dairy products, where it's going to come from? Right now, the U.S. is well positioned to step into that space, and these the level of investment we're seeing really speaks to that opportunity. So, with that, I'll turn it back over and can then get into talk more about e-commerce.
Mike, thanks for the information and insights. And with that in mind, by the way, it's stimulating questions, and I want to encourage you, if questions come up, please send them to the Q&A, as we'll cover them at the end of towards the end of the webinar. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian and Martijn to continue the discussion as it evolves e-commerce specifically and applicable to dairy. So Sebastian and Martijn.
Thanks, Dalen, and welcome everyone. I want to start by zooming out a little bit and providing some general information on e-commerce and share some of the experiences from my Amazon time, as well as my role currently at Kuehne+Nagel being responsible for e-commerce. I'm assuming that we've all ordered online before, and I want to start by focusing a little bit on the experiences we have as consumers and talk about the B2B, business to consumer e-commerce space, and then look at the parallels we see happening in the B2B space. Let me start by using an example to illustrate some of the essential points about e-commerce. The example is not related to dairy, at least not directly, and as painful as it might sound to you guys, I want to take you back to the time of the pandemic and think about an item that came extremely sought after, an item that radically changed people's buying behavior. You've probably guessed it. We're talking about toilet paper here. Now, even though it's tempting, let's not discuss the specifics of the buying behavior, but let's rather focus on the customer experience that consumers get when buying things like toilet paper. And again, it's not just for high-end or expensive goods, but toothpaste, toilet paper, anything has sort of a consumer experience with it that's pretty good these days. So if you think about buying goods online, some e-commerce leaders actually have really created experience that people love. Not necessarily the shopping experience online or the speed of delivery, but also the tracking. And as an example, I wanted to sort of bring up an example from what one of the leaders in this space actually offers. So if you think about the popular item that we just discussed, the roll of toilet paper. When you would order this on one of the larger e-commerce platforms in the US, you will actually be able to track on a map where your order is, when it will be delivered, how many stops the driver must make before he or she arrives at your home. Again, this is for all items, including the one under discussion here. And if you were to compare this experience you get from buying trivial items to how businesses buy and the experiences that businesses get when they buy from other businesses, it's in most cases vastly different. To give you an example, fax and email are still the norm for placing orders in a lot of industries, and delivery windows can be long, and accurate delivery estimation is also not standard these days. So I'm not sure if business buyers will be interested in following all their POs on a map in an app, but it is interesting that the buying experience for consumers and businesses is quite different. In fact, business buyers, who, by the way, are also consumers, are increasingly wondering about this. And the data suggests that they might prefer different interactions with their suppliers and different buying experiences when making business purchase decisions. So what they would typically then think about would be, why can I, as a consumer, follow my roll of toilet paper on a map in my pocket? But if I order critical parts that maybe support the business continuity of my business operations, I'm more or less in the dark. And of course, there's many differences in B2B and B2C and different complexities, such as shipment sizes, product values, duties and taxes, and less straightforward landed cost calculations. But there's technology, and technology can and helps solve some of these complexities and challenges. So let's zoom in a little bit more why we like to buy online. And again, this is true for businesses as much as for consumers. The key reasons always fall back to convenience, selection or offering, the speed of delivery, the price, and of course, these elements are not mutually exclusive. They reinforce one another. And if you want to dissect successes that large e-commerce players have, it largely comes down to being better at one or many times multiple of these drivers compared to brick and mortar sales alternatives. A lot of research has been done as to why this is, but for B2B and B2C environments, as well as both for the B2B environments as well as for B2C environments. I want to quickly share some research that IBM did a few years ago about B2B buying behaviors across different age generations. We're probably all familiar with the terms baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Y, and Generation Z. But why is this important? If you think about the percentages you see there here on the slide, they indicate the percentage of that generation that claims to shop online on a daily basis, according to a survey by Jungle Scout. And it's a little bit stereotyping, but we can also see what dominant buying behaviors exist for each of these 8 generations. Now, what's very interesting to know is that millennials tend to focus more often on the convenience factor than any other generation. What's also interesting that correlates with that is that IBM found that millennials now account for 73% of all the business-to-business purchase decisions. This is across all industries. So millennials, by far, are the largest group of business decision makers when it comes down to purchasing goods. And the B2C, the business-to-consumer customer experiences that these millennials have in their personal lives heavily influence what they expect from business-to-business transactions. If you think about it, if you think about the dominant behaviors, millennial buyers are more likely to avoid engaging with salespeople early on in the sales process. They like to do their own extensive research online before actually making purchasing decisions. And this is obviously very similar to the buying behavior they display online and their personal shopping habits. And it's the name that typically in the B2C space is used for that is digitally first buying. First looking at the phone, first looking at the web when orienting for purchase. So I want to stress that the key takeaway from this example is not on how millennials buy. This pattern that I just mentioned is visible across all generations, but it's most clear with millennials, and they also happen to be the largest cohort for making business purchasing decisions. So a lot of data here on this slide, and let me just quickly talk you through some of the highlights. This is an excerpt from research by McKinsey, and it looked essentially at the buying behavior and if it has changed much during the pandemic. And the outcome is that it hasn't. And this is for B2B buying online. It appears that while the pandemic may have fueled some additional shift, the behaviors seem to have stuck pretty much after that. What we can see is that the first 2 steps, the research into suppliers steps, were somewhat less digital before the pandemic, but from the start all the way through where we are today, this behavior has stayed very stable. What stands out notably is that 2/3 of all business-to-business buyers prefer non-traditional sales interactions across all stages of the buying process. This data highlights a driving force behind the B2B e-commerce growth and the rise of industry-specific portals and marketplaces that help B2B buyers to transact differently. Now, it should be noted that this is not just for pens and coffee cups in the office, but also for larger and more important buying decisions. If we want to put some numbers around this, I'm sure you're very interested in this, this data relates to the forecast for 2025. And what we see is that by 2025, the consumer e-commerce market is forecasted to be at $7.7 trillion. But at the same time, we can see that the B2B e-commerce space is projected to be almost $25 trillion, more than 3 times larger than B2C, which is a metric that many people typically don't expect. Of this total, we see that about $4 trillion relates to business-to-business marketplaces. And the share of this is projected to be double that in 25 of what it was in 2020. There's even research out there that suggests that B2B e-commerce will be more than 6 times larger than B2C e-commerce by 2030. So these are some bold data points. Now, it was a little bit of a journey to get from toilet paper to 25 trillion of B2B e-commerce, but putting some numbers behind the growth of e-commerce in the B2B space makes the trend very real. And so with that in mind, let's just focus a little bit on what this means for the dairy industry, and handing it over to Martijn here.
Thank you, Sebastian, for providing this high-over insight into the B2B e-commerce space. I'll dive a bit deeper into the implications this could have for global dairy transactions. And let's just start with an interesting statistic that we found based on research by Gartner that has shown that 43% of B2B buyers prefer to buy directly from the source. And 20% of those are also willing to pay a bit more for buying directly at the source. So direct business is great, obviously, but quite a few problems in our dairy industry need to be addressed before, during, and after a B2B transaction. And this is what managed marketplaces take care of. They don't just focus on the transaction as such, but on the full sales process. And let's take a deep dive into the components of a managed marketplace and what we can do with the data generated by that managed marketplace as well. So what you can see here is a nice visualization of a B2B marketplace stack with different components. So the main pillars are firstly knowing who you do business with, organizing the actual transaction, and making sure that the transaction gets fulfilled, the promise is being delivered, so to say. And on top of those components, extra tools can be added, services can be provided, and data is also generated by doing those transactions. So a marketplace is like an ecosystem where all players involved focus on their core business. So rather than everyone reinventing the wheel, connecting expert partners is a key characteristic of a successful B2B marketplace. And it's essential that the capability of those partners is on par to make it a success. Another important characteristic is that a marketplace is double-sided. So there are buyers on one side, there are sellers on the other side. And both of those sides can initiate a transaction. So suppliers can place offers and run auctions to look for suitable buyers around the world. And buyers can use marketplaces as procurement tools as well, finding the right products with the right suppliers. So if I'm going to go through these three pillars and compare the way we're currently working in the dairy market with the new way of working when using a marketplace and how that could support our business and our day-to-day operation. So the first pillar is one that has grown of importance in the last decade, I would say, because the most important factor in business is trust. So especially in this global market that we're dealing in, we just want to know who we're dealing with. So in a traditional B2B landscape, many deals are done with known, repetitive, trusted customers because you have a track record of those customers, and onboarding new customers or suppliers is always risky because you don't have that track record. So when we consider a new counterparty to trade with, we typically have three things we check or we have in our minds before we do so. So the first one is KYC, know your customer. So this is very much about, is it a company that we want to be dealing with, that we want to be associated with? Is it an okay company? Then we have the credit checks, making sure that the counterparty is basically good for their money. They will pay in full in time. And then we have reliability, which is in our volatile dairy market quite an interesting and the most tricky one, because that is based on experience and reputation. And typically, we don't share the information about our experiences with peers in the industry. So this is quite intransparent and hard to find out in, let's say, the old way of doing business. We have seen huge innovation developments in these pre-trade vetting processes. So before it was very scattered, so you'd have to check the company, get a credit limit, etc. But nowadays we can get almost like instant reports based on a company name and a registration number only, and get an insight in both the financial and the KYC information. And in terms of reliability, post-trade reviews also help, but we will explain a bit later about that. But the conclusion is that curating buyers and finding and doing business with new buyers has become a lot more simple, thanks to technology and all the good fintech innovations and initiatives out there. So at some point, we have onboarded this new customer, everything is okay. And that is when we work towards a transaction. So working towards a transaction typically means that we share a lot of information, documents, specifications. We need to compare, we need to check. A lot of back and forth is typically going on. When it comes to matchmaking, so matching supply and demand, technology can truly help to make that process easier and more efficient. And if we look at the dairy business, we spend a lot of time, I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of you, comparing specification parameters and approval lists. And marketplaces can make this process fully automated, automatically connecting the right product to a request and the other way around. And it's needless to explain that a marketplace provides a clear and instant overview of the availability and prices on the market as well. So prices become more transparent through a marketplace. Payment terms are an important factor, obviously, in concluding a deal. And because of the easy credit checks and KYCs in the previous pillar, it is more easy for finance providers to jump in and quote for delayed payment options. So a buyer can simply choose the payment term of their choice, and the seller can choose to get paid immediately, or they can choose to provide the financing themselves if they want. But that's become a bit more transparent as well. The same goes for logistics options. So you can choose the provider and the shipping method you like best as a buyer. And it's an open ecosystem, so more players can actually quote for the service. And as a buyer, you can make better decisions based on transit times, on-time performance, like Sebastian stated as well. So you can actually make a bit more educated decision on your logistics part as well. So then a transaction has been concluded, a deal has been done, and then it comes to fulfillment of the actual order. And this is where we can learn a lot from B2B or B2C e-commerce, as Sebastian explained with his example of toilet paper earlier on. So for a B2B buyer, an order of ingredients is just as important, or maybe even more important than sufficient toilet paper for a consumer. So why don't we have this service and this experience on par with the B2C space yet? The first thing that is a bit easier to solve through a marketplace is order management. So documents can be exchanged rather than email back and forth with different versions, can be approved, rejected, and shipments can be followed in real time, very much like the B2C example. And there are some great solutions out there in the market where you, as a buyer, you can just open a world map and see live where all your shipments are. And maybe more important, in case something happens or something changes, the buyer and seller get notified proactively rather than finding out when it's too late. Again, this is nothing new, but still not common in B2B transactions. Something else we can learn from B2C platforms, and this is one we really like ourselves at OpenDairy, is the use of ratings. So the seller rates the buyer after a deal, and the buyer rates the seller. We can even do the same for service providers, very much like Uber does. So when you take a trip afterwards, you rate the driver and the other way around. And this good behavior encourages more good behavior and a better service and a better customer experience. So this is basically making the whole reliability, reputation factor more transparent. So you get insight in the track record. And then the last part, in case something goes wrong, marketplaces can play an important role as well. This is very much the same in the B2C space. And part of the trust pledge that we've already mentioned earlier. So managing disputes through a marketplace increases the chance of a satisfactory resolution for both parties involved. So that about the main pillars that I showed in the slide earlier. What's left is the data that's generated by managing trade online. And if you look at this visual, you know, the big tech companies know a lot about our demand and behavior as a consumer. And demand, like Mike mentioned earlier as well, demand prediction is an important factor in the dairy market that we're currently struggling with. So it's such a shame that we have like decades of transaction data in all kinds of places, but until now, we failed to put this to good use. And the way we look at it from our perspective, it's different from this actual visual on the slide, because that's like companies on their islands mining their own data for their own good. Where we believe in a collaborative model, so in which all participants benefit from the data generated, because in the end we're one industry. And with this, we can really improve price discovery mechanisms, give more insight in supplier competitiveness in different regions, and also improve the product mix, because if you can anticipate on demand in specific regions, you can choose your product mix accordingly. So with all this, servicing the global dairy market will become a bit easier. And we will be looking to provide a B2C experience to B2B customers. And with that, Sebastian now will zoom out again and look at the similarities and the differences from a supply chain and from a KN perspective.
Yes, thank you, Martijn. And I'm really taking the lens here from a logistics and supply chain point of view, and recognizing that B2B is different in many different aspects. I think an important one Martijn already pointed out was the demand generation and forecasting, where the behavior of making purchase decisions is somewhat different, and how we forecast around that also then has to follow that. Typically, businesses do not buy goods for personal use, and the decision-making process is typically much more complex, multiple stakeholders. There's much less emotional and impulse-driven buys, right, as we all would recognize it. Also, the B2B transaction sizes are typically much higher. There's typically reorder frequencies as well, whereas B2B transactions, B2C transactions, most of those are one-off transactions capturing an emotion of a shopper. The product pricing in B2C is also less standardized, as we would see comparing that to the consumer space. So we look at sort of the space that we're in as Kuehne+Nagel, being one of the largest local or global logistics company. E-commerce is a very important business segment for us, and it's also an important engine for growth. In fact, it's part of one of the four strategic cornerstones that we've announced to the street earlier this year. And within that, B2B e-commerce and the solutions for marketplaces is actually an area of innovation for us. Another one of those four pillar stones is around what we've called the Kuehne+Nagel experiences, which really focuses around the employees as well as on our customers, and they will have to go hand in hand. So the part where I see logistics players, including ourselves, play an important role moving forward for the B2B space is very specifically the part that Martijn referred to as delivering on your promise, just like we would do this for B2C companies. I think we can provide great value for marketplaces and help them build really good B2B experiences, specifically around the supply chain and transportation topics. I think the industry is getting more ready to deploy better technology and to leverage that information. Good example of the history of order data that sits somewhere but isn't being used for forecasting that Martijn just gave. And I strongly believe that things like landed cost calculations, compliance hurdles can be solved in a very similar way for B2B as it has been solved or is being solved in the B2C space. From a supply chain provider point of view, we're at the front row of very important supply chain data. And with our investments in technology, we are rapidly expanding our set of solutions that could bridge these gaps. So I've worked quite closely with Martijn and OpenDairy over the last years, and I've been exposed to quite some ideas and potential for the dairy industry. And I'm pretty excited about what's to come, not just for the dairy industry, but for B2B e-commerce as a whole as well.
Thank you guys for your insights and information. And in just a few moments, we're going to be moving to our Q&A. We've got some great questions teed up, questions coming in, and to all of you, please feel free to send your questions and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. If you think about it, there are a lot of great business stories about market disruptors and how these disruptors became category leaders that transformed the world. I mean, just think about it. Uber, Walmart, Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, Apple, we could go on just to name a few. If you really want to have some fun, read the story of Clarence Birdseye. That'll take you a long time back. But an entire frozen foods ecosystem developed over a 20-year span of time as a result of a type of technology that Birdseye implemented for the food industry. And that infrastructure is still with us today. And very real food categories were disrupted as a result. And I think we can only imagine how, as we move from B2C, which we all experience and are used to every day, to a more transformed B2B world, how that might impact our industry. And I think one of the advantages of being older, I've had a chance to see over my lifetime cool things happen when technology is implemented, and it always evolves and it always impacts and it usually disrupts and changes things. It's really only the leaders who embrace and leverage that make a difference. So with that, we're going to turn to Q&A. And Beth, I think with that, you're going to, yeah, you see our pictures, and we'll turn off the slides. I would like to start with a question that has come in. And this is maybe for Sebastian, but also from others. When we saw the slide that talked about the 25% millennials who are in that B2B purchase space, there were 32% Gen Zs, and you didn't speak to what we might expect to have happen as those that generation moves into the same space. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and we can start seeing in the B2C space already some of the early signs there. I think these are still very stereotypical observations, but things like sustainability, brand identity are very big topics for that new generation. So they want to buy more ethically. They look for more sustainable shipping options, as I said, and are also willing to spend more there. There hasn't been much research on what those types of buying behaviors, how they would translate to the B2B space, other than I think we can establish that the trends around sustainability are present both in the B2C and the B2B space. So I think that is going to be one of the things that we can start seeing current, but also future business buyers look for more and more as they make buying decisions. I'm not just talking about the product itself, but also obviously the supply chain aspect of that. And needless to say, if you think about data and visibility in a supply chain, it's not just about cost and transit time and where's my goods, but also about carbon footprint and best alternatives. So I think those are topics that become more and more important.
Yeah, good, thank you. Another question, and this one, I think, maybe all of you can speak to it, but I'll pitch it first to Mike, if that's okay. So if you think about recent years, to what extent do companies with better data and systems outperform companies that had weaker data and systems?
I go back to 2020 as an example here, when we were in the heart of COVID and all the disruption and all the uncertainty of what was happening at the time. And I had companies tell me, and this is, and I won't name names, but I mean, large companies, whether they were retailers or food service or grocery, they said there was a noticeable difference in those companies, those retailers or end users that had really good data. And again, it's not just having data, it's having good data and knowing how to use the data. Were really, really important. And they said it was light years difference between those companies, to the point where some, again, large, sophisticated retailers, you would think on the surface, were calling them to place orders for the next week. And all they would say is, what do you think we should get? They didn't know. But then other retailers had the numbers dialed down so much that they knew exactly what was happening with all the different volatility that they were seeing across their consumer base.
Yeah. So good. Another response, Sebastian, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add the supply chain angle there. Pandemic is a really good example of where some supply chains broke down pretty hard, and directly not knowing where your goods are in times where there's massive port congestions and it's really hard to get containers out of ports and back into warehouses to be replenishing inventory. You could very much see that the companies that were better at doing that were generating sales, and the ones that didn't have product and didn't know where it was were not generating as much sales. It's a very straightforward relationship there. So I think it's a very unfortunate situation that happened, but I think it has also offered a lot of learning points for us as to how better data, visibility, systems to manage that can actually drive direct business impact.
Yeah, it's teaching us something. That's good. So a question from Martijn. So Martijn, you mentioned that connecting expert partners is key, but that we know that often business is done with who you know. How do companies confirm that their partners are also experts, or what would trigger a company to deflect from comfortable relationship to stronger expertise through using the marketplace approach?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's my answer can be for the previous question as well, which is about the uncertainties of digital versus the old or the traditional way of doing things. It's very much like going back to the B2C example. The first time ordering groceries at your home, it was not, for most of us, it was not a comfortable experience, because when you go to the supermarket and you pick the stuff that you need, you'll actually get it and bring it home. And the first time ordering online, you think hey, will it actually arrive? Will I be able to cook my dinner tonight, etc.? So there's an uncertainty to adapting to new ways of doing business. And actually, the only way to tackle that is to try it and to find out how good or bad the service is. But in the B2C space, we found that often we're amazed and even delighted about the level of service compared to what we've experienced. And that's why I mentioned having capable expert partners is key, because people are not going to switch to digital options just because it's like new or innovative. It should actually be better than the standard. And the only way to do that is to outperform the service that they would otherwise get. And that's what the expert partners can do.
Yeah, that might feed a little bit into a more specific question that is possibly connected. If you think about it, dairy ingredients typically have very strict and specific product specifications and requirements. How will this work using a digital marketplace approach to assure that the transactions lead to the right products?
Yeah, this is a very, I think, clear example, and one of the early inspirations of starting a marketplace, because I've been a dairy trader for 10 years myself, and I found myself with a yellow marker comparing specifications and making sure that what I was buying was suitable for the buyer on the other side. And this is something that technology can solve very well, because technology understands ranges, minimum, maximum, but also approved origins. And by doing a transaction online, it also forces you to agree everything up front. So even the smallest details will be included, rather than when you do a deal over the phone, sometimes you hang up and you think, I missed, we should have discussed that. So digital options and technology will lead to less mistakes and easier matchmaking.
Dale, and I just add one quick thing. This isn't brand new. I go back a long time ago when I was at Kraft, when Dairy.com started with cream scheduling. And when I managed the cream area, I had one person, that's all they did. All day Thursday and half a day Friday was on the phone, talking to plants, talking to suppliers, trying to find loads, finding what time it was. And it went to Dairy.com, and everything was just click a button on a screen. And it was so much easier. So this isn't brand new. We've been doing to your earlier point, we've been doing a lot of these things for a long time, and we found that they're time savers. The other thing I'd add is there's a generational thing here too, as you kind of alluded to, and I can be a little more blunt about it. Yeah, I'm not a young guy anymore. And as I talk to folks in the last few years, and I get to talk to some of the younger people that are in the business, I said, older guys, well, you want to talk to everybody in your personal relationships. It's like, we're used to doing business here on our phone or IMs, that we don't want to talk to people. We're very fine, very happy doing, using new technologies. So I think that's a part of this as well.
I think want to zoom back to the topic of uncertainty around having digital tools. I think a mistake we all have to watch for, which applies to many parts of our worlds, I think, is it doesn't always mean that having more data leads to better and faster decision making. And so and this is where I think marketplaces and providers in the chain can collaborate on this. I think ultimately that more information and more data has to lead to more insights that can drive the decision making. And if it's just about regurgitating more data and giving more options, you won't necessarily solve the uncertainty problem or make it go away. And that's, I think, a key point as well to keep in mind as we start developing these new ways of working, to really make sure that we keep focusing on making the decision making for the end customer, the user, much better than without that data and insight.
Yeah, I think those are good insights, is you have both the growing pool of data to help drive decision making, and then the tools to make it easier to make decisions, and then they both keep getting better through the process. And Mike, if I can say, I really love it when somebody younger than me says that they're old and not young anymore. Thank you for pointing that out. Got another good, interesting question to share. The question is, typically global dairy demand is expected to grow in less developed countries, like in Southeast Asia and Africa. E-commerce is more developed in the Western world. Do you consider that to be a mismatch or threat, or do you see that as an opportunity, and how?
I would say it's an opportunity rather than a threat, because I beg to differ. I think e-commerce is at least as developed in Southeast Asia and Africa. And speaking of Africa, most African, especially West African countries, have skipped the whole desktop laptop phase. They went from nothing to mobile. So especially West African buyers, they do everything on their mobile. So they're very, very suitable for e-commerce. And the same goes for Southeast Asia, for that matter. So I think that developing economies are adapting more quickly to mobile and e-commerce than the Western countries, especially on the B2B place.
I think the challenges you see around e-commerce adoption in those particular growth markets sit more on the B2C space rather than the B2B space. So what we see, for instance, on the consumer side is that when we place an order, and if you're in the US, you place an order, you have a credit card and you're completely comfortable with that. In a lot of developing countries, people will still want to pay cash, but they also want to buy online. So you have the whole pay cash on delivery or electronic transactions at the time of delivery of low value goods that need to take place, that need to be solved, which is a financial hassle. That is a lot simpler in the B2B space for aforementioned reasons, right? So I think the differences, the growth market potential is there. A lot of the complexities to be solved sit, I think, around the consumer behavior of the local consumers.
Yeah, good insight. Beth, I'm sensitive to time. Do we have time for one more question, or do we need to bring it to a close?
Hi, let's go ahead and do one more question, maybe around the table, and we'll close from there.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll close. I think that this is one. By the way, we have a lot of questions that hopefully we can capture and send to the group so that they can still respond to these questions, because there's some really great questions that are popping up on the screen. I'd like to ask, how might AI play a role as this dairy digitization evolves?
It's AI is always a tricky term because it's very fashionable, but you should see it in the right context, especially in dairy, I believe. As to predicting what the market's going to do, I think that's very difficult, because self-learning algorithms base themselves on historical events and relations. And I think if we've learned one thing over the last couple of years is that they don't always hold up, let me put it that way. But I think in terms of demand prediction, because we have quite a clear view on how supply is going to develop with farm gate prices and weather and all those kind of things. So it's easier to model supply, but modeling demand is really about data and about algorithms. And it goes much further than local milk production, consumption, and the rest is import or export. There are macroeconomic factors, early indicators, and I think if we could put all that data to use and put it in one place and have an algorithm learn based on that, I think we can do more robust modeling of demand developments around the world. And while we get better at that, we will be able to reduce volatility a bit as well, because the future becomes a little bit more clear by using those kind of technologies.
Anything else that either Mike or Sebastian would like to add?
Well, it's a topic that you could spend a whole dedicated webinar on. I think for me, the key point relative to AI is that digital commerce, e-commerce, makes data digital, which allows it to be used by AI. You can have all the AI tools in the world, but if you have a stack of papers on your desk that need to be mined, it's not going to happen. So I think for me, that is the key thing relative to e-commerce being an enabler for new AI technologies, because the information is all digital.
Yeah. Mike, anything to add?
I got, just a quick, I think it's a good summary there. To me, I look at it as, from the dairy cow on the farm all the way through the consumer. There's always inefficiencies in that supply chain and value chain. So there's always opportunities to find new ways of doing things and making it more efficient.
Thank you. So for me to make a closing remark and then turn it over to Beth, I just recently read an interesting book on how innovators create new categories and dominate markets. And one short quote, the most exciting companies sell us different, not better. Disruption's not their goal. Creation is their goal. Disruption is the byproduct. Today, we got a little bit of a glimpse of the possibilities of what digitization 2.0 might look like. And I'm pretty confident that as we see the years coming, that there is more shaping that's going to happen in this world and in our industry. Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you to close.
Great. Thank you so much. As we wrap up today, I'd like to thank Open Dairy for their sponsorship of today's event and our presenters for being with us and sharing their knowledge and insight. I would like to take a quick moment to invite everybody to attend ADPI's Dairy Ingredient Seminar this September in Santa Barbara, where we will continue this discussion as this feature panel will build on the foundation as they explore short-term opportunities and the long-term outlook for dairy e-commerce in international markets. For more information on this event and this session, please visit the event website, which is located at the adpi.org underneath our events tab. I would like to remind you that as a registered attendee, you will be receiving contact information for each of our presenters today. So a great way to follow up with a question you may have had that might not have gotten answered, as well as a copy of the presentation and a link to today's recording. You'll receive that all within 48 hours. ADPI thanks you for taking the time out of your schedules and to join us for today's webinar. Thank you and goodbye.